Hello, hello, and thank you for joining us for Learning to Grow. Today's video is going to be on starting a community garden or a garden plot in your facility. And I am here with Jenny Totten, who has really been helpful to me throughout the process of starting the Grow Farm and our entire process, and has been a mentor and somebody that I just will text randomly with questions about gardening to this day. So Jenny, do you mind just briefly introducing yourself, and then we'll talk about sort of what we're going to do with this video?
Sure. So as Jeannie said, my name is Jenny Totten. I have a background in extension, but now I work for the West Virginia Community Development Hub and then the Food and Farm Coalition. I'm here today mostly as a volunteer, but I have this community-based background too. I've been doing gardening with groups for, I don't know, I feel like it's been 15 years at this point. It kind of started in Haiti and sort of came back to West Virginia. So it just followed me here. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Very cool, very cool. I sent somebody the GIF yesterday of the old lady from Titanic. Like, it's been 85 years, and so it feels like. I
feel like it's been 85 years.
Yeah, 100%. So the goal in this conversation today is we're going to start to look at the process of starting either a community garden or just starting, a couple of raised beds in your facility space. If you're just starting that process, you don't have to have a garden space to start a Grow Fellowship, but it can be really helpful to have a safe space where people can connect to nature. So whatever that ends up looking like, I hope that this conversation can kind of help to guide you along that process. So Jenny, the first thing I want to ask is, let's kind of work under this scenario or this, imagining that you are starting a community garden, or you have this idea that you want to start organizing around a community garden. It all starts with that seed of an idea. So where do you even start? I think that's what hangs us up the most is I don't even know where to start. So what do you think?
Yeah, and I think a lot of, even professionals in the field, we don't always take the same path to get where we're going, right? So I come from this grassroots development background. So I say one person isn't enough. If you've got a great idea, you need to convince at least 10 other people you have a great idea. Jeannie and I can both tell some horror stories of managing single member community gardens where we've ended up with 15 beds by ourselves. And yeah, there's no hope of even upkeeping that as a full-time job, let alone a volunteer. So I would say start with if you've got the idea, that means that probably somebody else has the idea too. And so just find some friends. And then once you found some friends, we'll talk about resources later, but there's an amazing resource in the American Community Garden Association. If you just Google them, they have literally step-by-step how-to guides, but they all rely on building that team first of all. So start with building your team and then go from there.
100%. So that is one of the things, when I came home from DC and wanted to start the Grow program in Huntington, everybody else wanted to start community gardens at the same time. There were a lot of people with the same idea, but they all had their own vision, right? So and to this day, we run into this in our community where a lot of people are working on essentially the same thing, and they're not collaborating, they're not working together. But I do think, I agree with you 100% that the first thing you have to do is get some people behind you, because it is so much work to maintain something. I had a couple of facilities that would come to our farm and work with us, and it was still on me every day to go water and to weed eat and to maintain. And it just, your volunteers, there's going to be times when volunteers are scarce. There's going to be times when, people shift in and out of positions of leadership or volunteer leadership. And it will fall on your shoulders if you don't have people that are really dedicated early on in the process. So I totally agree with you there. So if we're looking at, we've got our team together, and whether or not that ends up looking like, a nonprofit, like you start a little, coalition together and start raising funds, or, just a little grassroots project that is maybe sponsored by a church or sponsored by a recovery facility. What do you think are the best ways to build this program or build a community garden space in the cheapest way possible, but in a way that's sustainable?
Sure. So like, let's assume you've got your team together. So you either have like, you're talking about like facility gardens and community gardens, and I think they're two different things in a lot of cases. So if it's a facility garden, there's some restrictions on supplies and whatnot you can use. I did a lot of work with the juvenile facilities in West Virginia, and it was, yeah. It's so first of all, if you're in like a facility garden, check and see what's allowed, and make sure that you like have done your homework there. And then if you're working with a community garden, the restrictions are usually far less there. But again, like if you're on leased property or whatnot, make sure you check in there. I would say like, so you're going to need, like basic things that you will always need include tools. So, shovels, hoes, rakes, etc. And there are a couple of really small tool grants out there. So Fiskars does one, and then Lowe's Toolbox does one. And they're like, they don't give you money, but they'll mail you a gift card that you can then use for garden equipment, which is great. And then yard sales are a great place to find tools. Little old men who are like retiring from their like 15-acre properties love to give away their tools to like enterprising young folks. So we've gotten a lot of stuff that way. And then another thing that I harp on is like the use of wood chips. Right? So everybody needs wood chips and compost and all of these things. And so check in the spring and the fall when they're trimming back the trees. I literally have chased down our tree trimming guys and been like, can you just dump them up by the hospital? And I feel like every community gardener has done that at some point. A school garden manager has done that at some point. It's like a running joke. Like you're not one until you've had to do that. And usually they're more than happy because then they're not having to find a place to dump. They can just dump them at the, you give them a place, then you'll come back and there'll be like 10 or 15 piles of like tree chips. And then for compost, you can a lot of city facilities have started doing large scale composting. Not so much in West Virginia. I know there's only a couple of facilities in West Virginia, but since this is a fellowship for the entire country at this point, so check in with any of your major metropolitan areas and see if they have large scale composting. If you know a horse person, you can get like, I would not get the green manure, but totally like if it's even sort of finished, just pile it up on your property and let it sit there. And within a couple months, you'll have like really good compost. I tell people to stay away from chicken manure just because it like, if it's not composted, it'll kill everything because it burns everything up. But any of, horse manure is usually is easy to get because when they clean out the stables, they just pile it up. And then so there are mixed reviews on reuse of containers, right? There's like, does the plastic break down? Does the rubber break down? My general rule is like, if the difference is food or no food for a community, it's more important to have food. And you can do some things. You can either like paint the inside of like the tires that you're using to seal, or you can paint the inside of the buckets or whatnot. As long as it is modern treated lumber, it shouldn't pose any problems. The arsenic in the lumber thing is kind of a relic from the 80s and early 90s. So that's like not really a thing anymore. If you have railroad ties though, I would avoid using railroad ties because there's a lot of stuff coming out of those trains. Use them for landscaping purposes, not planting food in. And so any of that stuff is like readily available, and a lot of times you can like find it, in the junk heap or whatever. I'm like a big trash to treasure person. I think if you're going to manage a garden, you will become a big trash to treasure person. A lot of, if you're doing like the super nice like cedar raised beds or whatnot, find them at the end of the season. Don't buy them in April, buy them in October for the following season, and they've usually been marked down. And then if you live in an area that has like a little tiny community foundation, I will tell you, like, they eat this stuff up, right? Because it's a real big impact for not a lot of money. So it's like, we can give this group $2,000 and we'll get a community garden that'll like put 5,000 pounds of food in the community. And so what better warm, fuzzy story in a single season than, you know, feeding a community 5,000 pounds worth of food. So those are like some real quick and easy ways to get you started gardening. At the end of the season, I always like, I'm the lady that like writes all the seed companies, and I'm like, if you have any extra seeds, can you mail them to me? And usually like you mail them a giant envelope and $10, and they'll send you like 500 seed packets. And, you know, in an ideal world, if you're doing production farming, you're not planting seed packets, you're planting pounds of seed, but free is free. And you just kind of go with it. Also, hooking up with extension in whatever state that you're in is amazing. All of the southern states actually have 2 extensions. So they have like the, like we have WVU, and then we have West Virginia State University. So we all have like the 1863 land, or the 1860 land grants, and then we have like the 1890 land grants, which are mostly our historically Black colleges and universities. So we actually have 2 sets of resources. The rest of you, just, it's usually your big state university, right? So in Ohio, it's Ohio State. In Virginia, it's Virginia Tech. In Kentucky, it's UK. You know, so when in doubt, just Google like land grant university, insert state here. And they have varying degrees of involvement in community gardening, right? So in Virginia, for example, like Virginia Tech has an entire division of folks that work on local food system development, and so they do a lot of community gardening. But when you get into like other states, sometimes they're way more like big farm production focused, but it doesn't hurt to ask, right? Especially in the Midwest, like it doesn't hurt to ask. Usually they'll have some guy that will want to come out and like tell you all he knows and teach you his ways, and that can be really helpful.
Yeah. So I have a couple points on what you just said. So I learned something literally last week that would have been brilliant when I first got started. So we were setting up we were more like revamping a little gardening space at a recovery facility here in town. And I said, you know, I kind of sent them a list of things that would be great to get donated. Well, we have a alumni of the program that now runs like the 3rd largest construction company in the area. Okay. He's at Home Depot every other day. I mean, literally every other day. So instead of us asking, like, you know, it's always great to be a spunky nonprofit that like people will want to help you and support you most likely. But when you have the 2nd largest customer of Home Depot in the area and he knows everybody, he got a massive donation. It was fantastic. I mean, I was just shocked. I showed up at the facility and I was like, I've never seen so much garden soil that wasn't like being sold. It was amazing. So that was a great thing. Like if you have any like community partners that are in the for-profit sector that are, you know, frequent customers of these places, they know people who will help you. And that's a great way to, you know, to get that. And then I wanted to talk briefly about, you know, if you are at the starting point of like, I don't even have land, there's 2 things that I would recommend looking at first. The first is, are there other community gardens that are either associated with extension agents or, you know, just projects? Do they need another group of people who care to come help support that space? And can they give you an hour each week to hold your meetings? I think that is a great place to start so that you don't have to start from the ground up. Like you already have that, that going on. Plus it's a great way to let people know about the program and to, you know, really serve the community, because I guarantee the people running that community garden will be so happy to have more hands. Like they just will. Yep. And then I wanted to tell the story. So if there are no community gardens, of course this wasn't the case in this story, but if there are no community gardens and you need space, I want to tell the story, Jenny, of how we met, if I may. I don't know if you remember this like I do.
Oh, I do. I think I do, but continue.
So, so I had this seed of an idea, right? And I had been pushing and pushing, trying to get some donated land from the city of Huntington, which the city of Huntington has this program where they will purchase lots and houses that are in tax delinquency, and it's called the land bank. And they had a number of community gardens on land bank properties, so there was already, a precedent for that to happen. But I was running into all these issues with zoning, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and it was, months and months and months of just punching a brick wall. So at the urban gardening or the urban farming conference that year, I see Jenny Totten heading into the bathroom. And I was like, I need to talk to her because she's got land bank properties with community gardens on them. So I walk in behind you and I'm like washing my hands for 15 minutes. Like I'm just waiting. So I actually cornered Jenny in the bathroom at the conference before you went in to teach a workshop to get your backing. And truthfully, a letter from your office was all I needed to get that property.
Yeah.
That's all that was needed. So, don't be afraid to ask. Maybe don't corner people in bathrooms. But
it was exciting.
It worked. Don't be afraid to ask, right?
And also, I think the other thing is like people have this misconception that you have to have land to garden. And one of the things, especially if you're like in a facility and you have access to like a sidewalk, you can put some pots out and like do plenty of therapeutic gardening with the container pots. And it's actually like a good way to start if folks aren't like open to gardening initially. I know like one of my gigs was like doing garden facilitation with preschoolers, which like sounds adorable and sounds cute. When you work with preschoolers, you get all the preschool problems, right? Which means, ew, I don't want to touch it, it's dirty. Or, ew, I'm just going to go like nosedive into this giant garden bed head first, right? And so with one of the preschools in particular, because the teachers weren't super comfortable gardening, we started with like little like 4-gallon pots and just put single tomato plants and peppers in those 4-gallon pots so that the kids could still have fun, but it was easy for the teachers to take care of. And that, by the end of that project, they had worked up to having like 8 or 10 raised beds, but we had to meet people where they were at. So, don't think that you have to have 5 acres or even like an acre or 5,000 square feet. Like you can totally do it with 20 pots outside your facility.
100%. And if you can address the issues of a facility, like for example, we had a facility last year that had some spots along their sidewalks, like between their housing. They had some spots that flooded when it rained. So we said, why don't we put in a rain garden? That's of course not something that you're going to do just like off the cuff first time gardening, but you can call your extension agent or local like environmental safety people, like look up who does rain gardens in the area. And we set up a couple of rain gardens and it fixed that problem, right? So that's a great way to build that relationship and to show that service is really part of the process here. Like service is a key value that we hold, right? So it's that give and take. I love that. I'm actually growing quite a bit in like 10-gallon buckets this year just because I wanted to show that you could. And it's really good, other than when it rains really hard and everything washes to the neighbor's yard. So it's interesting. But, okay. And then, so one of the things I really wanted to ask you about is reasons not to start a community garden. We're idealists here. I'm never going to lose that, I hope. But it is exhausting. It is really hard work. It's grueling. So I would love to get your perspective on, if you're really gung-ho about this, what are some reasons not to? Maybe a little reality check.
Yeah, so I think the first one, and this isn't just community gardening, this is like life, right? So are you the only person who's even like uttered the word community garden, right? Within your group of people? if folks are not excited, then you will be doing all the work, right? So in traditional community gardening, individuals come in and adopt a bed and they take care of that bed. In facility gardening, you're like working as a group. But if your whole group is not excited and you don't have buy-in, then it will be you working by yourself, but the group like might be cheering you on. But in my case, they usually heckle, right? Or like if you're doing community gardening with like bedded options, you'll end up with like 16 overgrown beds out of 17, and the only one that's pretty is yours. So it makes for a really frustrating experience to be a single person trying to do all that. Another reason not to start a community garden is like, take a good look at what's going on in your community to begin with. So this is something that I think is interesting that kind of goes back to social justice, right? So it's like, if the lay of the land is like such that people are, you know, the easiest way, well, let me think of how to phrase it. Community gardens are very much not thought of as food access in a lot of communities. They're pretty, they beautify, they do cut down on crime, and at the same time, often community gardens leave those most affected by hunger by the wayside, because those folks don't have time to participate in the gardening process, right? And so if you cannot find a way to involve those most affected, then there's no point in starting a community garden. Unless, like, if you're, like, doing an adopting community garden, like, if you're like, okay, these 16 people from this community are going to manage these 16 beds, and you have those 16 people, go for it, right? But don't try to, it is not the premise of food security at that point, right? It is the premise of, like, we're all gardening, and we're, like, growing cucumbers for our homes. So figuring out a way that best suits the needs of your community is really, really important. And if you cannot do that, then don't try it. But gardening is not the place to start. You need to start somewhere else. So like starting with community conversations and seeing if people come up with gardening would make sense. And then I think the third reason to not start a community garden is like, it's almost, I won't say it's overdone, but it's almost this thing where it's like, it was real big in the late 90s and the 2000s for every block to have a community garden. And it's almost super saturated at this point. And so, you know, I know in Huntington, I would look around, like when I lived there, I would literally ride my bike around Huntington and I could point out 20 gardens that people had started that were no longer in operation. And then they were just a field of weeds or morning glories or anything like that. And so it's like, is your community exhausted by this thought or are they energized by this thought? And if they're exhausted, don't do it. You know, garden in your backyard, right? That's what I tell people. Or put a pot on your porch. That's what I tell people. You know, I want to tell, like, I like to tell the story of my grandmother who, like, never actually admitted that she started a community garden, but she did, right? So she plowed up, like, 8 acres in Loudon, West Virginia, which is over near Kanawha State Forest. And, like, she did it by herself for so long. And then, like, folks would come, but she was, like, a grower. That was her thing. And then as she got older, people were like, oh, we need to help Dora out. And so they would come by and, it, like, naturally built this community around my grandmother. And, like, they ended up, like, you know, my grandmother's been gone for 3 years now. And, like, this garden is still going on the property that it's her property, which is weird, but it's still going on. And so it's kind of like, it was a natural growth. It wasn't a, like, let's just plant this and see if it works, right? And she was going to do the work anyways, and then people just came along to help. If you're going to do the work anyways, sure, go for it. But if you expect other people to help you, you better make sure you have those people before. How many times can I say it? Build a team first.
Yeah.
That's really roundabout way to say why not to do it.
No, I totally agree.
Code says don't do it. It's like your municipal code does not allow you to garden on vacant property. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's stupid to get a code enforcement violation because you planted some tomatoes. You know, go work with your municipality to change the code first.
Yeah, true. Rebel tomatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. There is so much that can be done just like with a couple, and they're very accessible, right? Like a small raised bed that is already, you know, on legs that you can either move if you need to. It comes in a kit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's so much that can be learned from one little tiny garden. or a couple pots. So much can be learned. And if you're really running into these hindrances and these issues, or it's hard to get people to buy in, because people will support something that they buy into if they think it's their idea, or they think that they are, you know, integral to that, you'll get some folks that stick around, and that's wonderful. But if you have to start by going on walks during your Grow Fellowship, like if you just go on walks around the neighborhood and pick up, you know, litter, that is a fantastic way to give back to the community, to get outside, to do those activities, and it doesn't require anything up front. So yeah, that's awesome. I just think that's very important as a reality check. You know, I don't want to be cynical about it. But, you know, understanding, you have to understand going in what you're committing to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you expect your garden to pay for itself, it won't.
No, it doesn't.
No.
You're not production farmers. I'm sorry.
Thought it could pay for itself. And the thing is, it's so, you become so reliant on must produce, and it defeats the whole purpose, right?
Yeah.
So finally, I just wanted to ask if there are any resources. You've already mentioned a few, but let's kind of delineate those resources and what they can be used for that will support people throughout this process.
Sure. So the American Community Garden Association has a fantastic website. Some years they even run a mini grant program, and they have like an annual conference. They have samples of everything you could ever need legal contract-wise related to community gardening as well, so like super helpful. Then your local extension offices, wherever those may be. I do want to point out in particular, Cornell Extension and Michigan State Extension and Virginia Tech all have really good community garden resources. And those are good for any state, right? Because it's how to organize people. It's not what to plant. So it doesn't matter that, you know, you might live in Alaska. You still have to organize people. I think any sort of, it's interesting for me to like look back now that I'm in a position where I'm like facilitating like meetings. I think facilitation training, if you can get it, is like probably the #1 professional development exercise that everybody should go through. It's managing community gardens. Because it teaches you how to deal with weird conflicts. And if you think your community garden is going to be like hunky-dory and unicorns and rainbows, it's not. Somebody's going to get pissed off that somebody else stole their watermelon or planted like, 16 extra onions. It just happens. So like facilitation training is super helpful. I think like, as far as like, I will send Jeannie like a list of some books that have been super helpful with kind of community gardening and kind of gardening in general. So there's a couple of books that are like just stories of successful community gardens. Most of them are urban examples, but like PBS had a wonderful series a few years ago, and this is like the book that came out of it. So I'll make sure that you guys get that. And then I also recognize that like community gardening in a lot of like community and facility gardening in a lot of cases are like, they need to be trauma informed. They just do. People get outside because they're hurting. And so anything that there's like, there's a fantastic series that's like the little book of trauma healing and like circle processes and da-da-da. And so any of the books from that series would be super helpful, especially if you're working in facilities and especially if you're working in communities that have experienced like some form of trauma, whether it's like, oh, we had a flood 5 years ago, or, oh, we had a shooting yesterday. There's a lot that people bring to a garden and they can't just leave it, right? They use the soil to work through it. And so understanding that and understanding how it's going to show up at your garden space is super important. So that way, both you can protect your own trauma from like reacting with theirs, but also you might be central in like helping them navigate some of that. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that specifically, because I think that will be probably one of the most important resources. There's a lot of practical stuff here in terms of like just building and finding these supplies, but returning to that trauma-informed focus is always super important, especially with the population that we're working with.
Yeah. I know like when I was working in the juvenile systems and even with preschoolers, like And because kids are more open to tell you what's going on. Like they wouldn't tell you in the classroom, but you get them, like you have one on your, like you have a preschooler next to you digging in the soil, and all of a sudden you find out like that he doesn't have food at home, that his parents are only there, 2 hours out of the day, he's raising himself. And you're like, oh my God, this is what I'm dealing with. It's better to go in knowing that that may happen and it not happen than to be blindsided by it. I was blindsided by it, and it was kind of, I'm still healing from it. We'll go there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's something that we do cover in the Grow Facilitator training, is not only how to approach these things in a trauma sensitive way, but how to manage your own boundaries, your own reactions, how to understand how to manage these things and these interactions without taking it home, right? Which is very important and something that you just have to continue growing and learning about. Yeah. Oh, Jenny, thank you so very much for doing this today. I really hope that, everybody who watches this video gets something out of it. We will link all of the resources that Jenny listed in the description below this video, and I'll make sure that those are available on the website as well. Do you have any final thoughts?
I'm just really happy that you guys as a group are tackling this. I think that oftentimes people decide that they want to grow gardens with people, but they don't necessarily understand the connection between like growing things, the outdoors, and healing. And so I think that third step, and then oftentimes people who work in a healing area do not understand the connection to the outside world and growing things. And so I think it's really awesome that everybody's trying to tackle this as a group. So.
Yeah, 100%. I think when the community garden folks learn about drug prevention and recovery, they go, oh, I've been doing this for years. And they get very excited because they have been. They just didn't call it that. They didn't know, they didn't make that connection.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you for tuning in today. I'm going to stop the video now.
Okay, awesome.
How do I do that? Oh, no.